You're listening to Teach Me the Bible podcast, where we unpack the meaning of books, passages, and themes from Scripture. Join us each week as Dr. David Klingler walks us through God's Word and teaches the Bible. Each episode has a study guide available in the show notes. This is Teach Me the Bible podcast.
Welcome back to Teach Me the Bible podcast. My name is Alex Wolf. I'm here with Dr. David Klingler. If you don't already know, if this is your first time joining with us, I want to encourage you to go on over and check out teachmethebible.com and check out all the other resources we have. So right now what we're doing is one thing that we have. It's the story of the Bible in a year. And so you're tuning in to part of that beyond halfway. And so we encourage you to go back to the beginning and start in Genesis and follow along with us. But also encourage you to go check out some of the other things. We have book studies where we're taking deeper dives into various books of the Bible. There's all kinds of resources over there, question and answer, blog posts and things for your enjoyment and for your growth and understanding the Word. And so check that out. We have just finished going through the Gospels, so we've recently gotten to the New Testament. And now today we want to take a little extra time and introduce what we call the Pauline Epistles, the letters of Paul, and just sort of orient our minds to what it is, what are epistles in general, and how should we be thinking about these things in relationship to the story of the Bible, and how do they really contribute to the story? Because unlike what we've been reading mostly so far, they're not narrative. They're not storytelling necessarily. Right. So how is it that we should understand these before we actually jump into the individual letters?
So we're going to take a week, take this time just to talk about letters, Paul's letters, and kind of a bunch of topics here, but things that are very important to kind of set the stage, set the frame, so that we can clearly understand these epistles. These epistles, epistle means letter.
Right.
These are probably some of the most familiar, at least where you probably have gotten some of your most familiar verses.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
What's interesting to me is outside of Alex, you can do this. Outside of John 3:16, how many verses from the Gospels can you quote?
Oof.
There's not many.
Right.
Jesus wept.
That's the one I remember.
I got that one, but I don't know where it is, right?
Yeah.
I can't quote it.
That's right.
I don't know where it was, but it's in there. Jesus wept, right?
He did it
in other words, most of our quote verses in the New Testament come from epistles.
Yeah.
I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to live is Christ, to die is gain. I mean, there's just so many of them, but they all come from epistles. Other than John 3:16, I often ask students, how many know John 3:16? They all know John 3:16. I say, what about John 3:15 or John 3:17? They're going, no, they don't know.
Hands start dropping.
Because we tend to want to quote verses, and most of the verses we quote are verses from epistles. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Well, and it's not random verses from epistles. You ready for this? It's verses we like. They're pretty. They sound good.
They fit us nicely.
They either fit our theology. And so if you hold to a certain brand of theology, you will have your list of verses for your personal belief defense, right? Yeah. And so that's one reason why we quote verses. Another reason is application. We like them, right? And so, I know the plans I have for you. That has nothing to do with what's going on in the Old Testament.
Right.
I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's a very encouraging sounding verse.
Right.
But you talk to people, they have no context to that verse, and so many of your theological views, if you're been around church for a while, or your applicational verses come out of the epistles. So these are letters, but let's state the obvious. Now, this is a shocker to most of our students. These letters weren't written to you. So Paul writes several letters. They are arranged in order from longest to shortest, basically. And Paul writes the first letter that we would consider is the book of Romans. Paul writes Romans to the Romans. see how that works? and we kind of go, no kidding, duh.
Yeah, right.
He wrote the Galatians to the Galatians and Philippians to the Philippians and Colossians to the Colossians. And he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy to Timothy and he wrote Titus to Titus and Philemon to Philemon. We're kind of making a joke of it. But in all seriousness, this is very important because Paul is going to say you or y'all. Right? And when he says you, or he gives a command to Timothy, he expects Timothy to do it.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Look out for Alexander the coppersmith and bring me my cloak and parchments before winter. And there's all kinds of things that Paul's going to tell Timothy to do. So letters, we live in a time where you can shoot off an email. An email is even takes some time and thought, right? But a text, you can just, bang some, little picture thing. I don't know what those things are called.
Doesn't matter if anything's spelled right.
Yeah,
Grammar's
just shoot
out
it
the
out. It
window.
doesn't matter. Really easy. But when you send out an email, particularly an email to someone to address an issue, you there's some thought that goes into it. And,
pull yourself together a little bit.
And you kind of word craft and edit and that type of thing. Think about a letter that's going to be handwritten and carried by hand to a people a long ways off, and that's going to be your communication. And and you're not just writing a letter back in that day to say, hey, just checking in and see how you're doing.
Right. It's not pen pal type of.
No, this is very expensive, very costly.
Yes.
It took a lot of time to not only write it, expensive to buy the materials, but then it took time to deliver it. Right. And so, an apostle writing a letter is to address a specific situation, right? There's a problem that is at the church in Rome. Yeah. There's a problem at the church in Galatia. There's a problem in Colossae, in Thessalonica, in Ephesus with Timothy. Timothy's going through some issues. And so Paul writes to Timothy to address the problem with Timothy.
Yeah.
There's a situation that has come up on the island of Crete. And Paul writes the letter to Titus to address that problem.
Yeah.
And so letters are very specific. They address very specific situations. So let's back up a little bit into the book of Acts. And so the book of Acts, we'll refer to the book of Acts as we go through some of these Pauline letters because the book of Acts records, it's really Luke. Acts is really Luke's, traveling with Paul, at least at the end of the book of Acts, and so the book of Acts really records Paul's journeys.
Yeah,
first missionary journey, second missionary journey, so and so forth and so on, and so we know where Paul went. We know when he interacted with these people, and the book of Acts gives us a little situation into what Paul did there. Luke wasn't with Paul on the first missionary journey, for example. And so the only way that Luke knows what Paul did is Paul had to have told him. And so it gives us a little bit of a backdrop, a little bit of backstory into what has happened. And so we'll refer to some of that as we go. First missionary journey, second missionary journey, third missionary journey of Paul. That's recorded in the book of Acts. And these letters were written along the way. But these letters all address specific situations. Everything in the letter addresses that problem and nothing else, right? So these letters weren't written so that 21st century believers would have a nice verse to apply to our lives, right? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Paul is saying that to the Philippians for a specific reason in a specific context, right? These verses weren't written so that we could defend our dispensational, Calvinist, covenant, whatever theological view you have.
Right.
That's not why Paul was writing these letters.
Right.
They were written to address a specific situation in their day, right? So Paul and Timothy weren't debating Calvinism versus Arminianism, okay? That's going to come over 1,000 years later, okay?
Right.
It's irrelevant to Paul. Paul doesn't care who John Calvin is,
who's John
and
Calvin?
he's not writing about Calvinism, okay? Or Arminianism, or lose your salvation or not lose your salvation, or dispensationalism or covenant, whatever. Yeah. And so we want to understand these letters first. What was Paul saying to those people at that time?
Yes.
What was the specific issue? How does Paul address it? Why does he say what he says? Mm-hmm. And how do we put all that together? Now, when we start to understand what he was saying to them, what the situation was, and how he addresses it, now that's informative of us because we're going to experience some of the same situations. Not all.
Right.
We don't have... for example, the problem of that was going on in Galatians, so the Galatian church.
Nobody's trying to circumcise
We don't have
Gentiles.
Jewish believers being persecuted by Jewish unbelievers for hanging out with Gentiles, and so the Jewish believers are trying to get the Gentile believers circumcised so they're not persecuted by the Jewish unbelievers. Okay, that's not an everyday common occurrence. In the 21st century church. Mm-hmm. It was in the early church. This was a central issue.
Yes.
Okay? And everything that's written in Galatians addresses that issue. But the way that Paul addresses that specific situation, the theology that he brings to present to address that situation is very informative to us in our theology, particularly our theology of salvation.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot to be learned.
And understanding
for
of the
us.
law as well. Yes.
And so we can agree with Paul when he says to Timothy that Scripture is it's good, it's useful for correction, for rebuke and training in sound doctrine, and so these letters were not written to us. Mm-hmm. But they were written for our instruction, for our application. But we have to get there in the correct way. So let's talk about that application for just a second. Yeah. So whenever Paul gives an imperative to the Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, or Philemon, whatever, he expects them to do it. Mm-hmm. It's direct application. Bring me my cloak and parchments before winter. Right. How is Timothy supposed to apply that to his life? Well, he's supposed to bring Paul his cloak and parchments before winter.
What does he mean by cloak and parchments?
Some spirit. It's got to be spiritual. Paul tells Timothy, preach the word. What's Timothy supposed to do? How's he supposed to interpret that? I don't know. Preach the word, right? Do the work of evangelist. Right. That means do the work of evangelist. It's straight, okay? But Paul isn't talking to us, okay? So when Paul says you, he's not me. He's not talking to David Klingler, 21st century.
Right.
When he says you, Timothy, he means you, Timothy.
Yeah.
When he says y'all, Corinthians, he's talking to the Corinthians. I'm not a Corinthian.
Yeah.
Okay. And Paul's not addressing a problem in my life. He's addressing the problem in the unity of the church in Corinth.
Yes.
And I can learn from that, right? And so one of the things that we talk about a lot, especially in the epistles, is the use of pronouns.
Yes. Oh, man.
It's
a big deal.
So here's what I always tell the students. If there's a we group and a you group, the we group is not the you group. Yeah. If the we group was the you group, you wouldn't need the you group. Right. There would just be a we group.
A we group, yeah.
Right? And so when Paul says we, and then he addresses the audience as you plural, or you singular.
Even in the same sentence.
In the same sentence, We isn't you.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not you, right? Why not say, as some slanderously say that we say? Right? That's out of Romans, and Paul's being accused of being in a group that's saying things, this is in chapter 3, verse 8, why not say, as we are slanderously reported, and some affirm that we say, let us do evil, the good may come. Their condemnation is right. So this is what they're saying about Paul. What we do is we grab a verse and we make it about us. Now, we've mentioned this verse a few times already today. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, that is in Paul's letter to the Philippians.
Right.
Notice that Paul doesn't say, y'all can do all things through Christ who strengthens y'all. That would be a little more
justifiable.
Justifiable to go grab that thing.
Yeah, right.
But why? If Paul wanted to encourage the Philippians in thinking they can do all things through Christ who strengthens him, and that may be the case, but that's not what he says. He says, I, Paul, can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Then the question becomes, well, what is Paul doing or able to do through Christ who strengthens him? And does that have any relation to my life, right? Maybe he's, talking about his plight as an apostle. Maybe he's talking about, I don't know, so you've got to have a context within which to understand that statement before I can go apply it to my life or think that it relates to me. There's other places where Paul will say things that you agree with theologically, but he's not saying what you think he's saying. And the reason why we know this is because of the argument he's making. So, for example, this is a good one in 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, here's a theological verse, and you may have heard this verse. You may even quote this verse. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And we're going, that's substitutionary atonement. That's Christ's substitutionary work on the cross. That aligns with my theology. But Paul isn't saying this of the Corinthians. Why do we know this? Because we read the first 5 chapters all the way up to verse 20, and we pick it up in chapter 6, verse 1, the next verse, and we read to the end of the book. And Paul is not including the Corinthians in anything Paul's doing. In fact, Paul's confronting them, right? And so Paul is defending his ministry again. Paul is a very unique character in this story. And this is important for us to understand all of Paul's letters, that Paul was the apostle chosen by God to take the gospel to the Gentiles, okay? And so they better listen to him, right? We apostles, right? Paul and Timothy, we, who are writing to you, right? So in chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. And so Paul and Timothy go together. And we have this ministry. We are ministers of the new covenant, right? Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, okay? We were chosen specifically. I, in particular, was chosen to take the gospel to you. And if you reject my words, you're in big trouble, right? And so all the way through this, many of the verses that you are quoting or you might know, they're not saying what you think they're saying. And because you think they're saying something they're not, it inhibits, it really enables your ability to understand what the letter is actually doing. Yes. So the letter is addressing a situation, and Paul is writing to address that situation. Paul the apostle, from his authoritative position as apostle, is addressing the problem that exists among y'all, Corinthians, right? And so he says, therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men, right? We are not commending ourselves again, are we? Of course not. So, he all the way through these letters, this 2 Corinthians in particular, it's we. And so therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. He's explained his ministry to them. As though God were entreating through us, we beg y'all, Corinthians, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, that we might become the righteousness of God in him, and working together with him, we urge y'all. Now, if you read those 3 verses, it's clear that the middle verse, 21, he's not talking about the Corinthians.
They're not in that group.
They're not in that group. And then he quotes Isaiah 49. And in Isaiah 49, the suffering servant Christ lays down his life for the servant Israel, so the servant Israel would serve him in taking the gospel to the Gentiles.
Right, yes.
And so Paul is identifying himself as a servant of Christ. Right? So he was rescued by the servant to serve him in taking the gospel to the Gentiles. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. These are key points to understand the epistles, because we have this, we've been trained to do it. You see it modeled all the time in sermons, all the time in Bible studies, all the time. We just kind of throw ourselves in there. Right? If we like the verse, it's about us. If we agree with the theology, it's our verse. We quote it. We put it on our bumper stickers, on our refrigerators, and above our mantle, right? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You see it
everywhere,
all the time, right? Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous, right? Well, you're not going to go take the land. Okay? So that's, but we like those little snippets that we can assassinate the context and make it about us, and then apply it to our lives however we want. The problem is that's not how it works. Years ago, I was just going through seminary, just starting, and we were in I was reading this little thing we had in the house. It was called God's Little Promise Book, and this is a bunch of garbage. None of these things were promises to me.
Just recording every promise in the Bible.
A promise to Abraham isn't a promise to me. A promise to David isn't a promise to me. A promise to Jesus certainly is a promise to me. God's instruction to Paul isn't God's instruction to me. But that's what we do. So we go in there and we grab the verses we like, and then we make them mean whatever we want them to mean. So we assassinate the context. And then we go, boy, this is hard to understand. Well, don't do that. Look, if you were walking through a parking lot, right, of a school, let's say, and I don't know if the little kids write letters anymore, but let's just say to make the point, or you intercepted an email. Someone sent you an email and it showed up in your account. But apparently, in reading this, it was an email from little Johnny to little Susie, right? And little Johnny's expressing his love for little Susie. You wouldn't say, Johnny really loves me. Well, you're not Susie,
right?
So no, he doesn't love you, right? If you're sitting in a booth at a restaurant, and this little Johnny is talking to little Susie, and Johnny's explaining to Susie how much he loves her. And then you're sitting there going, boy, he really loves me. Well, they would haul you off.
So you're insane at that point.
You're nuts, right? But that is exactly
what we do.
What we do with the Bible. Yes, it is. Okay. Now there's obviously a difference. This is the Lord, so the Lord is speaking through His apostle to these people, address their situation.
Right.
If we understand that, then we can understand, hey, we have a similar situation. And so the theology that Paul uses, the theology that Peter or James or John or whoever uses to address that situation is sound theology for where we also are in the story.
Yeah, we're in a similar place.
Now, if it's Old Testament, well, we're not in the same place, and so we're not being asked to go, slaughter the Passover lamb or whatever. We're not being asked to present sacrifices in Jerusalem, and you know that intuitively. But where we misinterpret most is in the epistles. At the seminary, I'll give examples. We do this. You've done this, the Deuteronomy project, where we do Deuteronomy, and you say, okay, here's how Deuteronomy impacts all of these different places in the Bible. And it's interesting to grade that in the Old Testament, they don't have a problem with saying, Moses tells Israel that they need to And then they go to the passage over there and says, and Ruth does this, or Naomi does this, and that's wrong, right, per the law. When it comes to the epistles, it's God tells us that we need and all of a sudden they just throw themselves in there and go, wait a second. How all of a sudden did you just jump in there and say this is all about me?
It's because most of our pastors' sermons are from the epistles, right?
They are. And because they're the easiest to understand and they're easiest to communicate. Right. But we also have tools, things like, some of these Bibles that are written to, tell you need to just put your name in every verse. This is God's love letter to you. Let me just say, no, it's not. The Bible is not God's love letter to you. It is God's revelation to us, to the church, to his people. But none of these, not a single book in the Bible was written to us. It was written for our instruction, but it wasn't written to us. Now, if we were Old Testament Israel, we could say all these books were written to us.
Well, and another point, too, is if you have anything written to you in large parts of the biblical story, it wasn't necessarily a good thing, right? Especially these letters.
Yeah,
right?
You didn't want to get a letter from Paul. No. All right, now. Let me fix y'all's mess.
Exactly. So you don't want to have a letter.
And so as we're going through these epistles, let's sum this up a little bit. So Paul, the other apostles, the writer of Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, John, Jude, James, they're writing these letters to a specific person or specific people to address a specific situation. Right. So there's an occasion that causes the author to write.
Yes.
And the author is writing to address that situation and really nothing else. Yeah. They're not saying, oh, by the way, I want you to know about, the 5 points of Calvinism, TULI, or justification, or and oh, by the way, I just want you to know you can lose your salvation. Now back to they're not doing that, okay? Right. And so everything they're saying is addressing that situation, and once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? So the author is writing to communicate to the reader, to address a specific situation, to get a specific response. Okay. Now, here's another place where we go wrong, is we put application in places where the author didn't state application. So letters are easy to apply because there's imperatives, right? Do this. Walk in a manner worthy. Husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Children, obey your parents. I wonder what Paul wants children to do. Obey your parents. I can say it slow, right? Yeah. I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you, right? So it's very direct. Now, the reason why you are to do what you're supposed to do, the hearer, Titus, is because of the why. Yeah. So most of these letters are structured as he's going to explain why. Yeah. Here's the problem. Here's how y'all are not thinking correctly about this problem. Here's the solution, and here's what you do with it. And that's how he's going to address the issues and problems for them. Now, if we understand what was going on then and there, now it informs us of who we are and how we are to live here and now. Right? And so we will get to application. Right. How does this relate to us, in the 21st century, in the church? Yes. But that is after we have understood what the author was saying to them. And it's going to ruin some of your verses. But make them better. Because you're going to understand them. That's right. Let me give you a perfect example. And we'll pick this up next week. We'll probably talk about this next week when we start Romans. If I were to ask students, it's seminary students. These aren't people that don't know the Bible. They have some Bible experience. And I ask them, is it true that there are none righteous, not one? Every single student in the class will say, yes, that's true. 100%. And then one will say, well, except for Jesus, right? And then the rest of the class will go, oh, yeah.
Right.
Except for Jesus. Yeah, except for Jesus. Of course, Jesus. And I say, really?
Well, there's one still.
Yeah. And I say, well, Paul is going to say that in Romans 3. Our little Romans road, there's none righteous, not one, and we have all these little things that we do. But I'll point out, if you keep reading in Romans, if you just go a little further down in Romans, actually in the very next chapter, just a few verses later, Paul's going to argue that Abraham was righteous.
Yeah, that's right.
That David was righteous, right? And you watch these students' faces, and they just like,
uh-oh.
Wait, what?
What are you saying?
And then you say, do you see what? So this is in Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 18. He's actually quoting a bunch of Psalms. Psalm 10, Psalm 5, Psalm 14, Psalm 53. There's several Psalms that he quotes through here. In every single one of those Psalms, there are not only righteous people, but righteous generation. For God is with the righteous generation. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his day. Noah walked with God. Job was righteous. Abraham was righteous. David was righteous. Lot was righteous. Righteous Lot. Peter's going to call Lot righteous. Paul is not saying there are none righteous, not one. He's quoting a verse out of a psalm. And in the psalm, there are none righteous, not one, who don't call on the name of the Lord.
There it is.
That's the psalm. That's Paul's argument. And so what he's addressing, the situation he's addressing in the Romans, is the Jews who think they're righteous simply because they're Jews. We're Jews. The law makes us righteous. He says, no, it doesn't. The law condemns you. There's only one way to be righteous, and it's through faith, through calling on the name of the Lord. So that's just an example of how when you understand what Paul is saying in the argument, in the message of the letter, and what he's quoting, and you go to all of those passages. One of my students gave me a shirt. It's an 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐢. I don't know if you know it. What's that from? Princess Bride. And it says, you keep quoting that verse. I don't think that verse means what you think it means, and it's actually one of our students and who gave me that. And he's actually using it in his church. I
that's
love it.
great,
and that's exactly right. And so it's not that the verse is a problem; it's that your understanding of the verse doesn't fit into anything the author's saying. He's quoting, if they're quoting Old Testament passages, that Old Testament passage has to be understood in its context, and then all of a sudden it makes sense. Here's where we're going to get pushback. You're going to say, well, yeah, that makes sense, but it goes against everything that I've been taught, everything I've learned, everything I think. I say, well,
why haven't I heard this before?
Yeah, why haven't I heard this? But that's why you don't know the Bible. That's why you don't understand the Bible. It's why you can't just open up and read it and it makes sense, because you're reading things out of context.
Yes.
And everybody talks about context. But I think what they mean is their theological context, right?
That's right.
But not what the author's saying to the audience, right? And so that's what we're going to do. That's what we have in front of us.
That's fun.
We'll talk about the Paul's, the background a little bit with the Book of Acts and his missionary journeys. But we're going to make very specific and intentional focus on pronouns. Who's Paul saying this about, and why is he saying it? How does it address the specific situation that Paul is addressing in the letter? And then what does he tell them to do in light of it? And then finally, lastly, how does this relate to us? And so that's our plan of attack as we go through the epistles.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm excited about the epistles. I think this is a fun process, especially because when I was new to the faith, I think I approached these like most people do today, and they're theological textbooks. You're reading it for theology, and I didn't understand that each of these most of them are written to address a problem, right? They're all addressing situations. Most of them are problems, and the interesting part is Paul doesn't always just come out and say, well, here's the problem I'm addressing. Sometimes it's fairly clear, but we have to sort of discern the problem as we read this. And so as we get into these books week after week, that's really what we're going to be doing. So why did Paul choose to? Why is he writing this book? What is he addressing? Yep. And that really just changes everything, like we've been saying. And so I want to encourage you to lean into that, to join in with us over the next several weeks as we go through these letters of Paul, and we understand why did he write this, and that's really going to make these come to life to you in the sense that you'll understand them for the first time, if you haven't already. So. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. Well, join us next week then as we, I think, begin with the book of Romans. We're going to
jump into Romans.
And see what it is that's going on in this book and how we can understand why Paul is writing it. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Teach Me the Bible podcast. Our desire is to use the power of God's Word to change lives. For more information, download our app. Join us next week for another episode of Teach Me the Bible.